As we continue down Abraham's line of descendants, we come to Jacob's son, one of his sons named Joseph. Now, I'm sure most people are familiar with Joseph's story. It's an account that's got a lot of detail. And really, to be honest with you, it's a very amazing story. It's one of my favorite stories, one of my favorite life stories in the Old Testament. Now, to really do it justice, it would take a lot more time than I'm sure many of you are interested in watching in one sitting. But if we consider these events as a whole, if we consider all of Joseph's life story, there is some really great encouragement there for us and some very important life truths found. While the details won't always be the same, unless, of course, your brothers have ever thrown you into a pit and were thinking about leaving you for dead, what Joseph experienced in his life is not really that uncommon from us. Joseph experienced some very severe family problems. Well, and so can we. Joseph experienced life seemingly going off track or going off the rails. Well, so can we. Joseph was tempted to sin and he was falsely accused. And unfortunately, that can also happen to us. Joseph, though, also was used by God in a very ordinary places and ordinary ways, but also in some very extraordinary ways, and so can we. So there really is some commonality between our regular daily life and the spectacular life that we read about with Joseph. Now, what is Joseph's experiences, and what should our experiences prove to us if we have the wisdom to look and if we have the courage to ask? Well, it's this, that God is in control, that we must trust God, understanding that He is always with us and is in control, even when it seems like everything possible that could go wrong is going wrong. Now, I want to urge you to read, if you haven't maybe in a while, I want to urge you to read Joseph's story for yourself, as always. You're going to find it in Genesis chapter 37 and then also chapter 39 through chapter 50. And I know that sounds like a terribly large amount of material to read, but I guarantee you it is well worth your time. Because today we're just going to kind of walk through some highlights so that we can kind of get a bird's eye view of what happened in Joseph's life. And this is mainly going to be coming from Genesis chapter 37 and chapter 39. And what we find here is that Joseph, the son of Jacob, of course, was favored over his brothers by their father. And as a result, as you can imagine, his brothers were jealous of Joseph, and oftentimes they were very critical toward him. Now, when Joseph was 17 years old, he began having some dreams. These were dreams that God had given him that showed that he was going to have authority over his brothers as well as his parents, for that matter. Now, we can fault Joseph here or not, but somewhat foolishly, Joseph shared those dreams he had with his brothers, and they became even more jealous than they already were. Now, Joseph had went one day to check on his brothers while they were out tending to their flocks, to their herds, and his brothers came up with a plan. They were going to get Joseph, and they were going to throw him in a pit and leave him to die. Well, after they had some discussion amongst themselves and decided they didn't want Joseph's blood on their hands, they decided instead they would pull him out and sell him to a caravan that was traveling by. Now, after this, Joseph was sold over in Egypt to an official named Potiphar, and it was in this Egyptian household that Joseph served very well. In fact, he became so successful in all that he had done that Potiphar promoted him to oversee all of his affairs, to oversee his entire household. And in verse 39 of Genesis, verse 5, it tells us, in chapter 39, verse 5, it tells us that the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. Now, Joseph, in his routine, in his daily work, he would come into contact, of course, with the whole household, but he also attracted the passion of Potiphar's wife, who on many occasions tried to seduce Joseph. Now, Joseph resisted. He was unwilling to sin, of course, against God, but he was also unwilling to sin against his master, his boss, Potiphar. But one day when Joseph went into the house, he went in and he was alone with Potiphar's wife, and she literally tore his cloak off, and Joseph fled the house. He ran away. Well, Potiphar's wife, convinced that she would never be able to have Joseph, he would never give in. She felt rejected and dejected, and she lied to her husband Potiphar about what Joseph had done, and then Joseph was stripped of his position, and he was thrown into prison. chapter 39, verse 20, it says he was thrown in the prison where the king's prisoners were confined. Now, just in this part of Joseph's life, we might expect Joseph to really begin to lose heart because of all these circumstances. But again, Joseph approached the situation with a very unique, very strong perseverance. And his abilities led to his success and led to his promotion again, even while in prison. In time, Joseph became the supervisor of the prison under the head jailer, and the Lord blessed all that he did. Now, in each of these positions that Joseph had, in Potiphar's house as well as there in the jail, Joseph was gaining a very valuable experience. He was gaining administrative experience. And if we read the rest of the story, like I said, through those other chapters, we find this experience was going to serve him very well later on as a ruler in Egypt under the Pharaoh. God would bring Joseph to Egypt, we see, as a teenager, after his brothers had turned him over to this caravan. And later, about age 30, Joseph would be promoted to the second place of power in this great kingdom of Egypt. Now, even stopping at this part of Joseph's story, and we won't go into the rest where he was serving Pharaoh and the famines and those kind of things like that, just because we don't have time. But even stopping at this point in Joseph's life, we can learn a great deal about his character. No matter how discouraged he must have been tempted to become at all these setbacks in his life that he experienced, we never see Joseph ever doing less than his very best. In these moments of crisis, we always see Joseph choosing to do what is right. Instead of being consumed, which we could understand if he was, instead of being consumed with bitterness against his brothers, instead of wanting to return hate for hate against his brothers and even against Potiphar's wife, Joseph looks beyond his circumstances to see the hand of God at work. And he remained certain that God's hand was on him for good purposes. Now, the reality, I think, for us is that sometimes we are very quick when we look at our life and we see our setbacks and we see our difficulties, we see the things that happen in our life, and we can sort of default to a position to think, well, that's not fair, that's unjust, or we may ask, why am I being punished? Is it something I did? We would do, I think, very well to have more of Joseph's trust in the goodness of God. Yes, certainly God does sometimes allow his people to go through suffering, to go into trials, but it's always done in order that he might bring through that suffering some greater good for his purposes and for his glory and ultimately for our good. I'm always impressed with how Joseph viewed his life circumstances. Later on in the story, over in Genesis chapter 45, as he does get to the place where he's confronting his brothers, Joseph said these words in Genesis 45. He said to his brothers, "And now don't be worried or angry with yourselves for selling me here, because God sent me ahead of you to preserve life. God sent me ahead of you to establish you as a remnant within the land and to keep you alive by a great deliverance. Therefore it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh, Lord of his entire household, and ruler over the land of Egypt." Then down in Genesis chapter 50, verse 20, and I love what he says here, when he told his brothers these amazing words. He said, "You planned evil against me. God planned for good, to bring about the present result, the survival of many people." You see, even through all that turmoil, even through all those tragic moments and difficulties in Joseph's life, instead of blaming his brothers, and of course, they were responsible for their actions, Joseph realized that God had used all of this for his good and for his glory, and ultimately it was for the survival of many people. As Joseph went on later on and was an administrator under Pharaoh, and he provided and prepared the land for a coming famine, and he was able to literally save his family from starvation and from any kind of retribution in the future from the Egyptians. But in this part of Joseph's life story, we find some godly advice for us as well. When we find ourselves challenged by others, when we find ourselves challenged just by the circumstances of life, one of these things I think we can understand is that I can be an example of God's grace when my family is in chaos. All kind of things can happen in a family setting. as we saw in Joseph's, and we even saw in other stories we've talked about, there can be favoritism. Where a parent favors a certain child over another, or a child even could favor a mother over a father. There can be jealousy within a family. There can be obviously disobedience and other kind of turmoil. But in all these things that go on in our families, we still, as believers, have to show God's grace. We have to practice kindness and compassion and be willing to forgive, to build others up instead of tearing them down. And that's, I think, something we see very clearly in Joseph's life, that he was an example of God's goodness and God's grace, even though his family oftentimes was in chaos. Another thing I think we can get from Joseph's story, in this part of it at least, is that as a believer, I can keep trusting God in turmoil, knowing that nothing can ruin his plans. Even in trials, even in temptations, even in difficulties, we continue to trust God, because God is in control. He knows what is best. God, and I think that's something a place we have to get to in our life, is to finally truly admit that God knows better than we do. That God will use any situation for his glory and for the ultimate good. And that's something I believe Joseph believed, and Joseph realized very, very well, that he could keep trusting God no matter the circumstances, because nothing could ruin, nothing could thwart, nothing could spoil God's plans. And then lastly, I think, if we take this and try to apply something to our life, is that, I can point people to God by honoring him in all that I do. That's what Joseph, ultimately, we see in Joseph's life. There are all kinds of places, like at work, for example, in the workplace, where God can use situations at work to develop our faith, and even to help develop and grow and encourage the faith of others. Challenges you have with difficult coworkers, difficult bosses, working your job well, even in the parts of your job that you don't really enjoy doing. Living a life of integrity, not cheating your employer, not cheating on your time card, not cheating on your taxes, anything like that. All these things, we have an opportunity, we have a privilege to honor God. And it doesn't just stop at the workplace. We should honor God, at home and obviously at church, but, at school, in our community, and whatever we're involved in. As a believer, we're to strive for excellence in all that we do. Why is that? Well, it's because, remember, we're ambassadors of Christ here. We represent God here on this earth. And Joseph, in many ways, was God's representative there in Egypt. And the way Joseph reacted to people and to his circumstances certainly pointed people to a God who was trustworthy and to a God who was faithful. Joseph, now again, like other people we've been studying in Abraham's line of descendants, Joseph, wasn't perfect. We mentioned the example of his dreams. I think Joseph would have been wiser if he had not touted his dreams to his brothers, because all that really did was fuel their jealousy. And maybe perhaps Joseph, had a smidgen of pride there, that he was, sort of touting and spouting off about these dreams that God had given him. But even in our own mistakes, even in any mistake that Joseph made in his life, God is always working out his good purposes, sometimes even in spite and despite what we sometimes are doing. So let me give you something to think about then as we finish up on this part of Joseph's story. A very important question, do you have faith in God today? Do you have the kind of faith that Joseph had? Because you've placed your faith in his son, Jesus. That's the kind of faith that enables you to stand against all that life is going to throw at you, all that the world is going to bring your way. Are you able to stand on your faith in God because you are one of his, and you truly do believe that God is in control? You have a choice, as we all do. You can continue to try to, tie that knot in the proverbial rope and hang on as tight as you can and just hope that you survive. But that's the thing. God doesn't just want us to survive. God does want us to thrive here in this world. And the only way we can do that is by understanding who we are before a holy God, that we're sinners and that we need a Savior, that we need to repent. And we turn then away from our sin. We turn away from our own life, living it our own way, trying to control it our way. And we surrender our life over to God by placing our faith in Jesus Christ. And then we truly are enabled and we truly are equipped to handle what life comes our way. That doesn't mean we're not going to make mistakes. That doesn't mean we're not going to sometimes trip over ourselves and even fall into temptation. But the wonderful thing about God is that He is more than willing to extend His grace, His kindness, His goodness, and His compassion to us if we truly want and are willing to return to Him. Well, I hope maybe in this just real short look at Joseph's story, and remember, I encourage you to go back and read Joseph's full life story for yourself and find encouragement there that we didn't even talk about today. I hope, though, that this has given you something to think about and to realize how fortunate we are as we live, that God is certainly in control. Believe me, you would rather have God in control than someone like me. You guys have an awesome day, and we'll see you when we see you. Bye.